Assalamu alaikum. Shalom. Welcome back to the United States. Thank you, Laurie, for your introduction. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for coming. I have to be brief, so I'll be terse. Like a number of people who are students of religion, I've spent a lot of time lately, as you should if you have the opportunity, I recommend it very highly, with Professor Dermot McCulloch's History of Christianity. Marvelous work of scholarship and literature, written by a mainstream believer, extraordinarily broad and deep, in which he ponders one very important question, the only one I've got time for now. What happened to the word Christendom? Remember, there used to be such a term. It used to extend across the world, and the hope is that it would extend even further. And it was unironically used to mean those areas of human civilization, and areas yet to be civilized, of course, where the word of Jesus Christ reigned or would reign. And it's all gone. The word is never used except historically or sarcastically now. And McCulloch doesn't say it ended because of the Crusades, though he could. It didn't. Crusades didn't kill it. Not because of slavery, mandated by Christianity. That didn't kill it either. Nor the mass murder of colonial subjects in the yet-to-be Christianized world. That wasn't sufficient. It didn't really end, he said, till 1914, when all the Christian empires of the world, Austria-Hungary, Germany, France, Britain, France is a slight exception to this, but only a slight one, and Russia, all of them commanded by Christian emperors and calling upon their subjects as Christians, went to war with each other and very nearly destroyed the whole human civilization, and certainly reduced it to a point where we can't guess where we might be if it hadn't been for this extraordinary outbreak of barbarism. And out of that came the terrors of fascism and of Stalinism, of which it was the seedbed as well. I mention this partly because I want to maintain that there's no such thing as a religion of peace by definition. And second, to point out, and that its best historian has to admit something that if I was a Christian would make me humiliated. But because there was another empire involved in that war, the Ottoman Empire, which also came to an end, its other name was the Caliphate, the Muslim Caliphate. It went to war on the side of German and Austrian imperialism and Hungarian imperialism, and it lost not just the war, having proclaimed a worldwide jihad against Christianity, except for German and Austrian and Hungarian Christianity, which were its allies. And it didn't just lose the war, but by 1924 had been dissolved by the Turkish leadership, by Ataturk. It lost the Caliphate. And that's the only one that still has supporters. The other Christian and religious empires have all gone. But the Caliphate still has fans, not just in the Muslim world, sometimes referred to by Muslims as the Dar al-Islam, the House of Islam, but also in what some Muslims call the Dar al-Harb, the House of War, the part of the world that isn't yet Muslim. There are Caliphate clubs in London now and Berlin and elsewhere, quite important ones. And what I want to know is why that is and what we should think about it. Believers in this fantasy have, Laurie's spared me the need to say much of this, have committed extraordinary atrocities in Istanbul, in Madrid, in India, in the Philippines, in Indonesia, and of course in our own fair city. And the pretexts for it vary. They can be, the excuse for the mass murder can be that Australia has helped East Timor become independent from Indonesia. They can be that Newsweek has printed a false story about the desecration of a supposedly holy book. You never know what it's going to be next. But everyone knows to be careful about it, and everyone understands that the threat of violence that backs it is believable. And that's my opening position. Now you will say, I can hear it already being said, you may be saying it already to yourselves because the defense mechanisms kick in. And in any case, Laurie already said it for you. And I hope Professor Ramadan won't feel the need to say it again, but if he does, fair enough. You may say, that's not the real Islam. Those aren't real Muslims. Now, isn't that a fascinating objection? Is there anyone in this room, I exempt Professor Ramadan because it's his turn to speak next, is there anyone in this room who would care to arbitrate that question? Who is to say, where is the authority that defines who is a true son of the Prophet or true interpreter of his work? Part of the problem to begin with, and it's part of the problem because it is a religion, is that it's perfectly true to say we don't know who the true Muslims are. How right that is, who does speak for it. Only the second problem with defining Islam as peaceful, only the second problem with defining it as peaceful has to do with the fact that it's highly fissile and highly schismatic, that there is a civil war going on within it, the religion of peace, as we speak. At least one civil war between the votaries of this religion of peace is already taking place, and some of it is exported outside that world into ours. Very salient fact. The first reason, though, is this. Islam makes very large claims for itself. Very large claims indeed. It claims to be the last and final religion, the last and final revelation. When you see bumper stickers, everyone says you can't reduce major things to a bumper sticker. It's not my idea to have bumper stickers saying Islam is the solution. It's a well-known slogan, actually, of parties associated with the Muslim Brotherhood. They say Islam is the solution for everything. It takes care of all your life and the one to come. Sexuality, political economy, banking, diet, relations with other religions, everything. It's a total solution. What is creepy about the word total? I hope I don't have to tell an audience like this. It's the first 5 letters of the word totalitarian. It's absolute. It's absolute. It's all-inclusive. It's unanswerable. And oddly, for a religion that makes such large claims, notice another thing about Islam, it doesn't particularly like having these claims questioned or scrutinized. In other words, just as there is with all religions an inverse relationship between the claims they make and the evidence they can produce for them, you must have noticed that, with Islam, a younger religion, and perhaps therefore more in its first flush, there's an extraordinarily strong willingness to say that any challenge to its absolutist claims is by definition profane. And profanity and blasphemy can be the antecedent to very severe punishment, and often are, for Muslims and for non-Muslims. And this is not a road of peace, in my submission. Thus my first point completed. The claim to govern everything from hygiene to sex and the afterlife, which contains detailed prescriptions for the good and bad versions of itself, again strikes me as somewhat totalitarian, and they're both based upon two very, very questionable and not very peaceful concepts. One is the idea of a perfect human being, the Prophet Muhammad, and the other is the idea of a perfect book, the Quran, the recitation. Now, the category perfect human primate or mammal and the category flawless book that could possibly not use any kind of change, revision, or editing are categories that do not exist. There are no members of these categories. Therefore, any challenge to this faith is bound to lead to heresy and to schism, and does. And just as all forms of absolutism and totalitarianism, leader worship and revealed truth, unalterable text, always do, because they can break, perhaps, but they cannot bend. And thus the latent potential of violence between them, among them, as well as within them, is very great. And at any moment, someone is in danger of being accused of being an apostate or an unbeliever. This week, the Coptic Pope of Egypt, Pope Shenouda, who represents 10 million Egyptians, was hustled onto Egyptian TV. He's not asked on all that often. I don't think he was even asked on this time. I think he was told he'd better come on. Why is the leader of Egypt's huge Christian minority suddenly compelled to make a TV appearance? Because one of his bishops had said in an interview that he thought that some of the verses of the Quran showed signs of having been added later on. and to have been later accretion. And Pope Shenouda was forced onto the television to say, it's not that that didn't happen, it's it couldn't have happened. It shouldn't even be discussed. So that it has to be claimed even by non-Muslim subjects of a Muslim state that there is, after all, because no Christian claims this about the Bible anymore, no Jew claims it about the Pentateuch. After all, yes, there is just one book that's completely word and letter perfect from the first time it was not even written down, but recited. Now, demands that you believe the impossible do not lead to peaceful outcomes, nor do they lead to peaceful or tolerant regimes. And I'm not going to ask you which Muslim country you would like to live in. I don't know whether Professor Ramana will tell us which one he would pick if he had to, because I don't have to ask you a question like that, because it's already in your mind.
Can you wind up now?
Yes, I can. I can, yes, and will. Shall, in fact. Sexual repression doesn't lead to peace. The idea that women are inferior to men is a profound cause of unease, let's say, the least of it. All religions make some form of this claim. Islam seems to make it less apologetically than most. Claims that the world will come to an end in an apocalyptic form, which will lead to the victory of one religion or another, are not peaceful either. It's possible, perhaps, I haven't exhausted all my remarks, that the endless teaching of battle stories to children and the stories of lethal feuds from 7th century Arabia don't lead to peace, or the forcing of children to memorize and retell such stories by rote doesn't lead to peace either. It's arguable that peace isn't attainable at all. It may be arguable in some forms, that sometimes in places that religion isn't even desirable, but it will not come by the fanatical adoption of a man-made text and a man-made supreme leader. Nothing but war and tyranny has ever come from the adoption of formulae like these. The only way to moral and intellectual satisfaction, even temporary, perhaps only temporary, but of any kind at all, comes to those who are willing to take the great risk of thinking for themselves at all hazards and trying to share the benefits of that tolerance and that open-mindedness with others. And with that, for now, I'll rest my case. Thank you very much.
A question from Vail, Colorado. Do Jewish, Christian, or other religions have a greater claim on being religions of peace than Islam? I mean, is your beef really with Islam, or is it with all religion?
Well, I'm sorry the comrade from Yale tuned in so late. I mean, late enough to miss the first 4 or 5 minutes of my 10-minute introduction, devoted to a close exegesis of Professor McCulloch's realization that Christianity had out-genocided and out-warred and out-crusaded itself, finally by 1914. If you care to pick up, I think you might be able to, and I'll sign it if you will, pick it up. My book, God is Not Great. You will find a discussion of the warrants for slavery, murder, genocide, and land theft that occur in the books of Moses, and that are an ineffaceable offense to any civilized person, and the reason why so many Jews are secular, at least one of the reasons. So again, I could go on, but I really feel I don't need to.
Okay. A corollary question, maybe it's just something funny. Would atheism be a non-religion of peace? That came
No.
from somewhere here.
No, there's something probably very slightly intolerant about atheism, at least so I hope. I might just say, though, because I really think Professor Ramadan misunderstood me. When I say the American Constitution is godless, I mean, I was quoting the title of a famous study of it by Professor Israel Kramnik. What I mean by that is to say, the US Constitution only mentions religion and God in its preambles when it means to say the ways in which they must be kept out of the public square. That happens to be a fact about our Constitution and the reason why we still have it. Otherwise, the Republic would have been destroyed long before. And that its First Amendment says that religion can be no business of the government, a statement no Muslim society could begin to make. Thank you. Well, I also don't think that the motion, if that's what it is, chosen for this evening, is a particularly good one. But I knew about it as long as Professor Ramadan did, and I did at least agree to speak to it, in spite of that reservation. And I make this not just as a point of self-pity, but because, for example, someone in this great city who's become used to making nice these days, Imam Rauf, who describes himself as both founder and visionary of whatever the downtown establishment is now to be called, wrote an article, I'm pretty sure it was on the eve of Yom Kippur, for the New York Times, in which he said, when you think about it, this is one of the most hand-washing statements I've yet heard him make in the Make Nice department. When you think about it, our word, Islam, is almost exact translation of your word, shalom. I didn't say it. I've never heard anyone else say it. It isn't true, among other things. Islam may have some relationship to the word salam, which can have some relationship to the word prostration or religious observance. It may. But we know what Islam means, is intended to mean, and does mean, is surrender to God. Acceptance of God's surrender, sometimes translated as submission, but in any case, the resignation to the divine will. Again, not, in my opinion, a prescription for peace, but that isn't my only objection to it. I don't think that abjection or fatalism or the prostration before a divine, or let alone before holy men who are interpreting the book, is a recipe for good health of any kind, mental or physical, since we're talking about the Greek concept of the body and of the spirit and of virtue. Just to get that out of the way. Now, you're right. I was surprised to find myself saying, Professor, when you say that the problem is not the book, but the reader. In the case of the Quran, that is certainly true of me. It's true probably of every book I've ever read, that there are difficulties I have with it or capacities I don't have with which to approach it or understand it. But if I'm reading the Quran, I certainly say, well, I can't tell whether this book is the Word of God or not. I can only doubt that there is such a thing. But I can hope that this was a bad day for God. Can't I? And I can hope to live in a country where I can say that and get applause. Yes, and even mirth. And don't think that it isn't a precious thing, and don't think it's being compromised. I'm coming to that. I don't like the idea of a paradise reward for martyrs. Don't like it. It's not me somehow. Don't like the account. Don't like the early accounts of village squabbles with the local Jews who've taken a look at the new claimant to be the Messiah and decided about him what they decided about the previous claimant. He's no good. He's not up to snuff. Do you think the Jews are ever going to be forgiven for that, by the way? For rejecting two in a row? I don't think so. And I don't see why they should hope for. I don't see why they should hope for forgiveness either. And still I'm allowed to stand here and say this. And there are many parts of Europe I couldn't do that anymore. Or I'd have to be very careful in who I'd invited for the audience. I couldn't do it easily on the air. Couldn't do it easily in print, couldn't do it easily in public, couldn't do it on certain campuses, couldn't do it with certain publishing houses. Now, all of this has been done to us by the wrong Muslims. Well, let's get together then, isolate who these wrong Muslims are, who've imposed a culture of violence-backed censorship upon us, and let's get rid of them and have an honest discussion about the text and the reader. And I think the ball is in your court, Professor, on that. Just to stay with my own profession, the thing I know best. Not one major media outlet, print or broadcast, has yet shown you what the Danish cartoons actually look like. Yale University Press, which commissioned a book on them which was to include the cartoons, as how could it not, eventually panicked. Yale University Press panicked and published the book without the cartoons over the objections of its author. Everybody knows what I'm talking about. The President of the United States and the head of the Joint Chiefs a few days ago were so pulverized with fear that they had to address personally in pleading tones a Christian nutbag in Florida who might have been or might not have been about to commit a minor act of blasphemy. Is this the culture that Islam wants us to have in relation to it? One of, if you like, preemptive submission, preemptive cowering, backed by the fear of force? Because that is not multiculturalism. That's nothing like the gorgeous mosaic. That's actually the absolute negation of what a multicultural system would be like. And a multicultural system has to look rather askance, I think, on a religion whose preachers and websites openly make threats against people like myself, against the Jewish people, against the Hindus, who, for heaven's sake, aren't even monotheists, can be killed on almost any pretext, against, and a very important point, and I have to make it, and against the wrong kind of Muslim. Now, Professor, I'll say this as mildly as I can, you may not be aware that you were, and I don't want to increase the area of unexpected offense-taking that's been so hugely broadened by the sensitivities of a religion that has the answer to everything. But I'll just say I don't greatly care to be told, as if I didn't know, that an Iraqi life is as precious as an American one. And as someone who's visited Iraq quite a lot, had the occasion to think about it a good deal, I wonder if you could mention anything the United States has done in Iraq that is remotely as criminal, as sadistic, and as violent as the blowing up of the Mosque of the Golden Dome in Samarra. One of the holiest sites in the Muslim world, callously blown up by Sunni forces in alliance with forces who, perhaps I'd agree with them for once on this, were fascistic Baathists. Probably they got the weapons and the high explosive from them. That makes it worse, surely. Intending to start, and successfully, in fact, initiating a civil war in which countless thousands of people have been killed, religious processions have been fired upon, funerals have been fired upon, Qurans, without number, of course, been incinerated, much more importantly, children, old people, and civilians. Now, where is, I just wonder, you must be able to quote it to me. Where is the Sunni fatwa against this conduct? Where is it? Where is the authoritative statement of moral outrage in the Sunni world saying this is not acceptable behavior for followers of the Prophet? I missed it. And so apparently did the followers of the Prophet miss it, because they keep on doing this all the time. They were doing it before the United States got to Iraq, and they'll be doing it after we've gone. So I'm sorry I won't be talked to in that tone of voice. And I want to know, I repeat my question, who has the authority to issue fatwas? Is it Sheikh Qaradawi, who you sometimes very much expressed respect for, who on Al Jazeera gives advice on all kinds of things, some of them innocuous, sexual matters and so forth, doctrinal rulings, sometimes upon the legitimacy or otherwise of suicide bombing, if directed at Israelis, not just Jews, of course, but no, we draw the distinction. On the other hand, Hamas, which does the suicide bombing, doesn't draw the distinction. If I can't issue a fatwa against Hamas, if I'm a Muslim, if there's no one who will and they won't, surely someone could say, we don't think Hamas should have on its website and manifesto the reproduction of the protocols of the elders of Zion, a Christian fascist fabrication that is one of the warrants for the Nazi exterminationist solution. I mean, surely that's a question for the UN Anti-Racism Committee on a spare day. Or since that spare day never seems to come, for some Muslim authority to say, no, brothers, don't do that. It doesn't come. It doesn't happen. Look on the website, it's still there. Now, you would do better, I think, Professor, if you identified yourself as a member of a very small and critical and endangered minority. Someone who really is against all this and will say so, and will also decry the fact that the religion itself can't seem to throw it off. But you seem to have that a little bit both ways. Now,
I'm going to have to
very well.
stop you so we can get to
Yes,
discussion.
so then my closing statement is this. If you want diversity, as much as the professor does, as much as I'm sure many people here do, religious diversity, cultural diversity, what you need for it is this. You need a secular state with a godless constitution like this one. To speak as you did of the Ottoman Empire as a place where there were not just Muslims, but Christians and Jews is either not to know yourself or to expect others to have forgotten or not to know what it meant to be a non-Muslim under the Caliphate or under any similar theocratic Muslim authority to this day. No, what we need, secularism is the only guarantee of religious freedom, and yours and that of every other Muslim we will defend. But you won't be surprised that we have some questions for you in the meanwhile. Thank you.
I want to distill something that came up here, two important things. One is the question of authority in Islam. A scholar once told me that he thinks the problem with Islam is that every Tom, Dick, and Harry can give fatwa. And that there's no pope, there's no magisterium, and so in some ways, what you have is leadership by whoever has, the biggest audience. Now, right now, one of the most revered scholars is Yusuf al-Qaradawi, and he says he takes an opposite position from Professor Ramadan on the question of suicide attacks in Israel. He has a program with 40 million listeners, and he has a website. And he says that suicide attacks on Israeli citizens, even women and children, are acceptable because all of Israel is a militarized society and all citizens are combatants. So the question here is, he's got this very large audience, and since there is no arbitrating authority, there's no single authority, is not what Islam becomes whoever has the biggest audience, has the sway in what the faith is?
I think that I think it's true. If we look at what is happening now in the Muslim majority countries as well as in the West, that there is something that we can call a crisis of authority. In the book Radical Reform, I'm tackling this from many viewpoints, and not only from political discussion. It's really even in our way to deal with sciences, human sciences, ethics, we have this problem. When you don't know how to manage diversity, it ends up with division and not knowing who is leading. And this is the way. We don't have a church, so we have diversity in Islam. So we have to know how to manage this, and it's problematic. And I would say that if you look today at what is happening, even though we have this crisis, if you look today at what is happening around the world, you will see that we have many councils. Still, the mainstream is not promoting, violence and extremist views. The mainstream is promoting, what is said, for example, about Western Muslims or Muslims living in Muslim majority countries is about transparency, no corruption, democratization. This is the mainstream that is coming. Now we have voices. And you speak about Yusuf al-Qaradawi, and you were saying that I was one of supporters of him. I have one position in everyone and everybody I'm dealing with, in history, in the past, and as is in the present. I read what is said, and I try to be selective. So, for example, on that point, killing, I said no, I disagree. On identity, and when he once was very harsh with me saying, no, we have one identity and it's Islamic, I said, no, we have multiple identity. I'm Swiss by nationality, Egyptian by memory, Muslim by religion, European by culture. These are my identities. He didn't agree. So I talk to people, but I know that on this, for example, in Israel, I disagree with him, but you cannot reduce Yusuf al-Qaradawi in the world today to this position, because he had many other positions on women, on the society, on democracy, he is promoting something which is, he called democracy in the Muslim majority country, that you have to consider by saying, okay, on this we disagree, and on that. We need to have a critical debate. You cannot just, because one position, we don't like one position, we remove the people from the landscape. No, they are part of the landscape, and they are heard in the Muslim majority countries. So this is my position on that.
Well, I'm certainly not going to criticize Islam for not having a pope. And in fact, it would be your vis-a-vis in this discussion was horribly in error in any case, in that Christianity never had only one pope, and still doesn't. I mean, there were several Catholic claimants to the papacy at different times, just among Roman Catholics. But today, I mentioned one of them, the Pope of the Coptic Christians based in Cairo. The Eastern Orthodox don't call their leader the Pope, they call him the Patriarch, but the Christian world is full of Pope types, usually anathematizing one another. The Pope is just the word that innocent Americans use for the man who claims to be the leader of the Roman Catholics. So I don't think it's possible, in fact, to have a moral authority within religion, because I think the two things are so sharply divorced. But this doesn't lead to just chaos, because, and it certainly doesn't lead to the dictatorship of minorities or extremists. I'll give you two examples quickly. In the case of the moral blackmail of Denmark that was backed up by a physical threat to destroy its economy and burn out its embassies across the world, well-coordinated attack of sabotage against a small European democracy. The organizing group was a thing called the OIC, the Organization of the Islamic Congress. Groups all the Muslim countries in the world. It's an increasingly powerful lobby at the United Nations, hopes to pass an international resolution forbidding all criticism of religion, all forms of blasphemy and profanity. Every ambassador of those countries in Copenhagen went to Mr. Rasmussen, the Prime Minister of Denmark, and told him, under the threat of violence, he should change his law so as to allow him to determine what went into the Danish newspapers. And when he said he couldn't do that, things got a lot worse. Now, that's the ambassador of Egypt, and the ambassador of Turkey, and the ambassador of Algeria, important countries, in the case of Egypt, containing an enormous Christian population, coming to you as if they spoke for a religion. Either this claim is true or it is not. It's self-evidently not true, but it is certainly made. Let's be in any doubt about it. And let's have any doubt that it means to extend its influence over the people who are sitting in this hall. Second, very quick, the fatwa against Salman Rushdie, in other words, the offer of money to suborn murder for the crime of writing a work of fiction in his own name by the spiritual leader of Shia Islam, that's what the fatwa meant then, means now, was, after the murder of many people, associated or not with the publication of the book, repudiated ostensibly by the Iranian government after long pressure and lobbying at the United Nations, about 10 years ago, I think that was. But I've been since then, I've had the pleasure of going to Friday prayers at Tehran University, twice, to hear the sermon. And on both occasions, there were banners and slogans saying that the Imam's holy sentence against Salman Rushdie will never die. It hasn't died with the Imam. Khomeini's death warrant will always be carried out. Not, I think, a very good use of the premises of a university. I can't speak for whether it's a good occasion for Friday prayers or not. Well, it brings me to a second point. You see, there's something shady involved here. Some people say that Islam and Islamists give themselves permission to lie to non-believers. It sounds like the sort of vulgar, paranoid thing that an Islamophobe would go around saying, doesn't it? It's very easy to disprove, except that it hasn't been, as that example will just illustrate. And these are not minor threats. These are threats to the very core of what we believe is the essential thing for a society, which is the ability to ask questions, to read the books we choose, to pursue unfettered investigations. And these are flatly negated by the claims of a religion that says it is the answer to everything.
Are you saying Turkey is moving in a progressive direction as it becomes more Islamist? Is that what you're saying?
That's quite interesting, the way you translate what I said.
Yeah.
it says much more about what you think than what I said. But
Well, wait.
let me finish.
You said it was moving in a
she-
more progressive direction.
No, what I said is that even the people who are now leading the country, that are referring to Islam and they were perceived as Islamists, now we don't know how to call them. Are they Islamists, or are they moderate Muslims, or are they ex-Islamists? The point is that no one here can deny the fact that not only the government, because we can be and we should be critical towards the government, but the people around and the intellectuals in Turkey and within even the party, you have new thoughts, and they are coming with something that we didn't see even in the Muslim majority countries, in the Arab countries. So speaking about the rule of law and democracy and transparency, separating and promoting what they are trying to promote, and to be in tune today with the European principles. And I would say this is the only thing for me which is important. If, for example, Turkey is abiding by the European rules, they should be able to integrate European Union, and not what we have now, because it's a Muslim majority country. We don't care about what they are trying to do. So don't reduce Turkey to labels. There are dynamics, there are people who are promoting things that are quite interesting. I went there many times, and I can tell you the women in Turkey, the Turkish women, for all the trends, not only, from the secular, for the Islamists, everywhere, they are promoting a better understanding of Islam, a better acknowledging and resisting discriminations, and trying to work for more autonomy. And I would say this is what I said, and this is what I promote.
Well, actually, I agree with you that there was a very ossified, Ataturkist, bureaucratic, intolerant system that to some extent has been opened by the challenge from Mr. Erdogan's party. But the reason why Turkey continues to be looked on askance by so much of Europe is not because it's a Muslim majority country. It was a Muslim majority country long before the European Union was formed. And no one's just discovered that. The faith of most of its people is Muslim. It's because of legal and political reasons. One of them is continued illegal occupation of the Republic of Cyprus, which is already a member of the European Union, and the expulsion of a large proportion of its population, the reduction of them to refugee status. Erdogan's been worse on that than his predecessors. The second is the refusal of Turks to admit that they're not the only people living in Anatolia, that there's another nation called the Kurds that lives there, which has language and national rights which have been negated. On that, actually, the Erdogan party's been slightly better than some of the Ataturkists. And the third is the continuing campaign of falsification and lying about the massacre, the genocide of the Armenian population. A continuing disgrace which Erdogan...
Okay, we won't.
Which Erdogan
let's not linger in
has
Turkey
made,
too long.
has spoken of in the most thuggish possible terms. Do I get the same question? I don't mind.
Would you like to close with that?
On Sharia.
It really is. I find
No,
it's,
okay,
it's
I like surprises. Well, Sharia just means law. I mean, all people who say Sharia law are making an elementary mistake, and of course it's not the case that every thief has their hand lopped off in Muslim society, or every adulterer gets stoned. And so, and I'm perfectly sure that's not just because it would diminish the labor force so radically, or so to speak, disable it. I think it's more because of something I've claimed to notice elsewhere, which is that religion is man-made. And so there are enormous discrepancies in how these things are promulgated and also how they are enforced. And most countries and societies come quite early and easily to the conclusion that their own religions are, in one form or another, not really practicable. After all, in Saudi Arabia, a woman can't even drive a car, whereas in Iran she can vote, not for much, but she can, as much as a man can, let's say. Her vote can be stolen and degraded as much as her husband's or her brother. There's an infinite variation. I don't know. I can't shake what I saw once on the BBC from someone whose career in London I followed. I don't know if you know him. You wouldn't like him. A guy called Anjum Chowdhury. He's a very well-known noisemaker around London, complaining about secularism, Judaism, all this kind of thing. And he's been in trouble with the law a few times, and was interviewed on the BBC, went on about how nothing would change until the green flag of Islam was flying over Downing Street and Buckingham Palace and so forth. And was asked, I thought quite mildly by the BBC interviewer, he said, well, if this is the way you feel about Sharia and about total Islamic rule, wouldn't you feel happier moving to a country where they already had it? And which is, a polite question, but a rather cheap one. But still, what didn't prepare me for the answer? Chowdhury looked straight at the guy and straight into camera and said, what makes you think this is your country? I thought it was a very good question. Now, why do you feel, I think I know partly why you feel, why do you feel it's necessary to affirm that? And of course a Muslim should learn the language, should obey the laws, should observe the customs and so on. Most immigrants don't feel they, so to speak, absolutely have to say that. The answer, I suspect, is that it's embarrassing to notice that in places like as far apart as Sweden and as Spain, there are groups of people who say their countries should be part of the caliphate and that that's why they've come here. And if it wasn't for those people, you wouldn't be in this position. So it seems to me that in order to be consistent, you should fear them and dislike them, find them morally and intellectually repulsive, at least as much as, if not more, than I do. And I don't say that you don't, but I do think that is the urgent priority. On the lady's question about where would be the best country to live if you were a Muslim and wanting to be a member of a sexual or gender minority, or I think she said a female or a homosexual. So hard to confuse. Actually, the easiest place for you to live in that case would probably be, I was thinking about it while Professor Ramadan was talking, would probably be, this will be my closing statement, would almost certainly be either Bosnia-Herzegovina or Kosovo. Culturally Muslim, democratic, open societies in southern and Balkan Europe that were saved from obliteration by the power of the United States, which has never had a word of thanks for what it did in that region. And which remains a secular country with a godless constitution.
That's a note on which we can end.
Which is the last best hope of humanity. Thank you.
All right. Thank you both. I hope it's been an enlightening evening.